To Sports Love Media on YouTube. It's you guys, Sports Love, with another live stream today, August 12th, 2025. This time we're doing Major League Baseball games August 15th, 16th, and 17th. My perspective. We're going to go over who is going to be playing in each of these Major League Baseball games. We're going to go over who the starting pitcher is and any other pertinent information, and then I will make my picks for who I think will win the game. Can y'all hear me out there in YouTube land? Anyway, let's get into this. For August 15th, 2025, you have the Chicago Cubs versus Pittsburgh. The game is at 1:20 p.m. Central. You have undecided versus Colin Ray. Milwaukee will play Cincinnati at 5:40 p.m. That'll be undecided versus Nick Martinez. You have Philadelphia versus Washington, 5:45 p.m. Zach Wheeler versus Mackenzie Gore. You have Texas versus Toronto, 6:07 p.m. Jacob deGrom versus Chris Bassett. You have Atlanta versus Cleveland, 6:10 p.m. Eric Fed versus Joey Cantillo, 6:10 p.m. of course. You have Miami versus Boston, 6:10 p.m., which will be Sandy Alcantara versus Lucas Giolito. You have Seattle versus the New York Mets, 6:10 p.m. Central. Logan Evans versus undecided. You have Baltimore versus Houston, 7:10 p.m. Brandon Young versus Framber Valdez. You have the Chicago White Sox versus Kansas City, 7:10 p.m. Sean Burke versus Noah Cameron. You have Detroit versus Minnesota, 7:10 p.m. Casey Mize versus undecided. You have the New York Yankees versus St. Louis, 7:15 p.m. Louis Gill versus Andre Paliante. You have Arizona versus Colorado. That's 7:40 p.m. with Brandon Profat versus Tanner Gordon. You have the Los Angeles Angels versus the Athletics, 9:05 p.m. with Yusei Kikuchi versus Jack Perkins. You have San Diego versus the Los Angeles Dodgers, 9:10 p.m. Michael King versus Clayton Kershaw. You have Tampa Bay versus San Francisco, 9:15 p.m. Joe Boyle versus Carson Wisenhunt. Hello to you, Gum Gum. I do appreciate that very much. We're just going over Major League Baseball games for August 15th, 16th, and 17th. We're going over who's playing with, starting pitchers, other pertinent information, and then who I think is going to win. Hello to you, Plelo. I appreciate that. Thank you for joining me today. So, now for my picks for Major League Baseball for August 15th. I have the Chicago Cubs defeating Pittsburgh. Cincinnati loses to Milwaukee. Washington defeats Philadelphia. Texas defeats Toronto. Cleveland defeats Atlanta. Miami defeats Boston. The New York Mets will defeat Seattle. Baltimore defeats Houston. Chicago White Sox loses to Kansas City. Detroit loses to Minnesota. Detroit wins to Minnesota, sorry. I have the New York Yankees losing to St. Louis. I have Arizona defeating Colorado. The Athletics defeating the Los Angeles Angels. San Diego defeats the Los Angeles Dodgers. And Tampa Bay defeats San Francisco. Anyway, next is the games for Saturday, August 16th, 2025. You have Pittsburgh versus the Chicago Cubs, Texas versus Toronto, Philadelphia versus Washington, Miami versus Boston, Seattle versus the New York Mets, Milwaukee versus Cincinnati, Atlanta versus Cleveland, Baltimore versus Houston, Chicago White Sox versus Kansas City, Detroit versus Minnesota, New York Yankees versus St. Louis, Arizona versus Colorado, Tampa Bay versus San Francisco. You have San Diego versus the Los Angeles Dodgers, and the Los Angeles Angels versus the Athletics. In the Pittsburgh-Chicago Cubs game, 1:20 p.m. Texas-Toronto, 2:07 p.m. Starting pitcher for the Chicago Cubs-Pittsburgh game will be Mike Burrows versus Shota Imanaga. 2:07 p.m. for Texas and Toronto with Patrick Corbin versus Eric Lauer. 3:05 p.m. for Philadelphia and Washington. Tajuan Walker versus Undecided. Miami, Boston, 3:10 p.m. Cal Quantrill versus Brayan Bello. Seattle versus New York Mets, 3:10 p.m. Brian Wu versus Sean Manaea. Milwaukee versus Cincinnati, 5:40 p.m. Quinn Priester versus Zach Littell. Atlanta versus Cleveland, 6:10 p.m. Joey Wentz versus Slade Ciccone, however that's pronounced. You have Baltimore versus Houston, 6:10 p.m. Cade Povich versus Colton Gordon. Chicago White Sox versus Kansas City, 6:10 p.m. Davis Martin versus Ryan Bergert. You have Detroit versus Minnesota, 6:15 p.m. Chris Paddock versus Zebby Matthews. New York Yankees versus St. Louis, 6:15 p.m. Max Fried versus Sonny Gray. Arizona versus Colorado, 7:10 p.m. Ryan Nelson versus Undecided. Tampa Bay versus San Francisco, 8:05 p.m. Adrian Hauser versus Justin Verlander. You again have San Diego versus the Los Angeles Dodgers, 8:10 p.m. Dylan Cease versus Blake Snell. And you have the Los Angeles Angels versus the Athletics, 9:05 p.m. Jack Kokonowicz versus Luis Severino. Hello to Tanya and Fernando. It is greatly appreciated that y'all joined me today for this broadcast. Now, let's go over who I think will win the games on August 16th of 2025. I have Pittsburgh defeating the Chicago Cubs. Toronto defeats Texas. Philadelphia defeats Washington. Boston defeats Miami. Seattle will defeat the New York Mets. Cincinnati will defeat Milwaukee. Atlanta defeats Cleveland. Houston defeats Baltimore. Kansas City loses to the Chicago White Sox. Minnesota defeats Detroit. New York Yankees defeat St. Louis. Colorado defeats Arizona. Tampa Bay defeats San Francisco. Los Angeles Dodgers defeats San Diego, and Los Angeles Angels defeats the Athletics. Hang on just a minute, we got a train coming and I can't hear. Sorry about the train. I will continue here in just a moment. Alrighty, for the games on August 17th, I have Philadelphia versus Washington, 10:35 a.m. Ranger Suarez versus Mitchell Parker. Miami versus Boston, 12:35 p.m. That'll be Jansen Junk versus Garrett Crochet. Texas versus Toronto, 12:37 p.m. Nathan Eovaldi versus Jose Barrios. Atlanta versus Cleveland, 12:40 p.m. Spencer Strider versus Logan Allen. Let's see. Milwaukee versus Cincinnati, 12:40 p.m. Freddie Peralta versus Andrew Abbott. Baltimore versus Houston, 1:10 p.m. David Kremner versus Jason Alexander. The Chicago White Sox versus Kansas City, 1:10 p.m. Jonathan Cannon versus Barbie Falter. I have Detroit versus Minnesota, 1:10 p.m. Jack Flattery versus Undecided. The New York Yankees versus St. Louis, 1:15 p.m. Will Warren versus Miles McCollus. I have Pittsburgh versus the Chicago Cubs, 1:20 p.m. Andrew Haney versus Undecided. I have Arizona playing Colorado, 2:10 p.m. Anthony DeScalfani versus Kyle Freeland. Tampa Bay versus San Francisco, 3:05 p.m. Ryan Pepiot versus Logan Webb. Los Angeles Angels versus the Athletics, 3:05 p.m. Jose Soriano versus Jeffrey Springs. San Diego versus the Los Angeles Dodgers, 3:10 p.m. Yu Darvish versus Yoshinobu Yamamoto. And then you have Seattle versus the New York Mets, 6:10 p.m. George Kirby versus Clay Holmes. Here is my picks now for who I think will win the games on August 17th. I have Philadelphia defeating Washington. Miami defeats Boston. Texas will defeat Toronto. Cleveland will defeat Atlanta. Milwaukee will lose to Cincinnati. Cleveland will win to Atlanta. Houston defeats Baltimore. The Chicago White Sox defeats Kansas City. Detroit defeats Minnesota. The New York Yankees loses to St. Louis. Chicago Cubs wins over Pittsburgh. Arizona defeats Colorado. San Francisco will defeat Tampa Bay. The Los Angeles Angels will defeat the Athletics. The Los Angeles Dodgers will defeat San Diego. The New York Mets will defeat Seattle. And hello to you, Fernando. Again, I appreciate you, and welcome to Tanya. Anyway, let's go back and review who I have winning the games for Friday, August 15th, 2025 through Sunday, August 17th. For Friday, August 15th, I have the Chicago Cubs defeating Pittsburgh. Milwaukee defeats Cincinnati. Washington defeats Philadelphia. Texas defeats Toronto. Cleveland defeats Atlanta. Miami defeats Boston. New York Mets defeats Seattle. Houston loses to Baltimore. Kansas City defeats Chicago. Detroit defeats Minnesota. St. Louis defeats the New York Yankees. Arizona defeats Colorado. The Athletics will defeat the Los Angeles Angels. San Diego will defeat the Los Angeles Dodgers. San Francisco will defeat Tampa Bay. For August 16th, I have Pittsburgh defeating the Chicago Cubs. Toronto defeats Texas. Philadelphia defeats Washington. Boston defeats Miami. Seattle will defeat New York Mets. Cincinnati defeats Milwaukee. Cleveland loses to Atlanta. Houston defeats Baltimore. Chicago White Sox defeats Kansas City. You have Minnesota defeating Detroit. The New York Yankees defeating St. Louis. Colorado defeats Arizona. Tampa Bay defeats San Francisco. I have San Diego losing to the Los Angeles Dodgers. The Los Angeles Angels defeats the Athletics. Finally, for the games on August 17th, I have Philadelphia defeating Washington. Miami defeats Boston. Texas defeats Toronto. Cleveland defeats Atlanta. Cincinnati will defeat Milwaukee. Baltimore loses to Houston. Chicago White Sox defeats Kansas City. Detroit defeats Minnesota. St. Louis defeats the New York Yankees. Chicago Cubs defeats Pittsburgh. Arizona defeats Colorado. San Francisco defeats Tampa Bay. The Los Angeles Angels defeats the Athletics. The Los Angeles Dodgers defeats San Diego. And the New York Mets defeats Seattle. So there you have it. That is Major League Baseball games that will be taking place August 15th, 16th, and 17th of 2025. It is my perspective on who I think is going to win those said games. Thank you very much for taking the time to hear this broadcast on Sports Live Media today. I do greatly appreciate each and every one of you that has joined me today for this broadcast. If you will, please hit the like button, please hit the subscribe button, please hit the share button, and please hit the notification bell so you can be made aware of when I'm covering Major League Baseball games such as these prospective games that I just went over, when I have sports action videos, when I have sports education videos, when I broadcast live, or when I have breaking news in the sports world. If you wish to subscribe to the channel, it would be greatly appreciated. There are two ways to go about doing that. One is you go to www.youtube.com, the /sportslov. The other way is you go to the YouTube search tab and type in Sports Live Media. That is SPORTSLOV Media, MEDIA, 2 words. Put that in the search tab and you'll find me. You'll know it's me because I have Sports Live Media burned into a basketball as my avatar. I'm also on Twitter X. My handle for Twitter X is at BobAmin16. That's the @ symbol, BOBAMIN16. I look forward to seeing you on Twitter X and through YouTube. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Just to let you know, a couple of announcements. One, we have started the college football top 25 college football, my perspective. We just did episode 1 for season 2 today. The next one will be in about 2 weeks once they get through week 1 scheduling. And then after that, it will be done on a weekly basis throughout college football season. We will cover all of college football regular season games. We will cover the conference championship games. We'll cover the playoffs. We'll cover bowl games, and announcements on when those live streams will come available as they do. We will also have other live action live streams regarding certain athletic competitions as that comes along, and I will announce that as those come out. We will also be having more sports action and sports education videos coming starting later this week. It's been kind of slow in that area due to the fact it's been summer and, there's not much going on, but that's about to start picking back up. So I just wanted to let you know those few things. So does anybody have any comments, questions, concerns? Anything they'd like to add? Well, if not, I thank you for taking the time to tune into this live stream today. I'm Sports Live Media, and I'm signing out. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you very much.